this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to remind everybody of the most important fact in the entire universe. God loves you. I also want to note, for those of you who have been watching, we are going back tonight and recording episode 27 over again. I had it pointed out to me by a viewer that my tone was a little bit salty when I first recorded this episode, and I went back and watched it, and sure enough, they were right. In all of this, my goal is to present these topics, and as we walk through this, keeping in mind the most important part, that Jesus loves us, that God loves us. And if I get lost in being a little bit salty in doing so, it just messes up the message altogether. So apologies for having done that wrong. So we're going to re-record tonight, maybe do a little bit better job, get a couple of other things correct, but lose the sharp-edged tone. If you ever sense a tone in me, there are times where I get passionate, and I will admit that. But it's never my intention to get out there and certainly belittle anyone or be angry or mean to anyone. And apologies for having done that the last time. So deleted episode 27, and I'm reposting episode 27, and then I'll put 28 and 29 back out there just as soon as we're done. So jumping back into where we started off tonight. On the last episode, on episode 26, we had looked at that question of, so what is the most likely explanation for how the universe came into existence? And you'll remember there were three choices. Option number one was that an intelligent third party created the universe. Option number two was that the universe existed past eternal, so it's been around for forever and there is no reason to determine an explanation for it. Disagreed with that for a couple of different reasons. Number one, even if it's been around for forever, it still requires an explanation. How did it get there? And number two, scientifically, we looked at a whole lot of reasons why that doesn't make good scientific sense. And so we excluded that as a possibility. And then our third option was that the universe had simply popped into existence. From nothing came everything. And that doesn't work from a scientific standpoint. If you hold to a strict definition of nothing, then that doesn't work. And so we ultimately determined that of those three, and I know not everybody agrees with this, totally get it, but of those three options, option number one is the most likely choice, logically and scientifically, that an outside third party has to be responsible for the creation of the universe, at some finite point in the past history. This week, we're going to take our next step forward in the journey. We start this process now looking at, we've started the journey, where did the universe come from? Now we have to answer the question, well, what kind of a universe did we get? Let's look at the universe itself. And does the universe that we have offer us any clues or insight as to who might be that candidate for how the universe got here? You know, there's a couple of different mindsets out there and possibilities. The first is kind of a Star Trek mindset, that life is easy, that everything just happens, this is the way it's supposed to be. There are, in the Star Trek world, thousands of M-class planets out there, and somewhere there's a happy-go-lucky United Federation of Planets keeping law and order out there. Well, I guess that'd be Starfleet's job for the United Federation of Planets. I don't want to get too deep in the Star Trek nerddom there, but anyway, it's important stuff to Trekkies out there. But the other question is, well, no, wait a minute, maybe life is a lot more difficult than we think, and that it's much more complex, and what are the odds really that there's a lot of life out there? Well, we're going to get into that question. We're going to start looking at that tonight. As we do so, there's a couple of important steps I think to take along the way, and there's a couple of important questions that it would be good for us to answer. The first tonight that we're going to look at is this question of something called the Anthropic Principle. And how much information does it really give? You hear this term thrown around a lot, and it sounds incredibly official and incredibly important. And it's an important scientific concept, but it can only offer us a limited amount of information. And so tonight we're going to start by looking at the Anthropic Principle, seeing what it tells us, which is some good information, but then making sure that we don't go too far with it and jumping in over our head. So let's start by looking at that tonight. What is the Anthropic Principle, and how does it help us in our journey? So we're going to go back to our old friend Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, gives us a really solid definition of what the anthropic principle is. Let's go to Dawkins' book and we'll walk through what he says here. The anthropic answer in its most general form is that we could only be discussing the question in the kind of universe that was capable of producing us. Okay, that's a pretty good answer. So as we take a step back and we look at the universe around us, we could only be here and living in a universe that was capable of supporting us. So from that, what we can determine is that the universe is fine-tuned to support life on this planet and potentially life elsewhere as well. So it's fine-tuned to support life. That makes pretty good sense. I think we can all buy that. Well done, Richard Dawkins. That's a good definition. But that's all it tells us. It doesn't really tell us how it got that way, what were the odds that it would be that way, or anything else much like that. I mean, it doesn't give us a lot of useful information. It gives us a little bit of information. I don't want to make it sound like it's unimportant, but it would be wrong to try to draw too many conclusions off of it. And unfortunately, I feel like Richard Dawkins does that later in the book. And we're going to start walking through that with his next sentence, which is a little bit confusing. And then later on down the road, we're going to see him apply the anthropic principle in a way that I don't think is appropriate. So let's take a look here. Continuing with his quote. The anthropic answer in its most general form is that we could only be discussing the question in the kind of universe that was capable of producing us. Great, we're all on board. Our existence therefore determines, don't love that word, our existence therefore determines that the fundamental constants of physics had to be in their respective Goldilocks zones. Okay, so I think we all remember the story of the three little bears and Goldilocks. Remember, Goldilocks shows up at their house, she eats their porridge, one bowl was too hot, one bowl was too cold, and one was just right. And that's kind of where that phrase, the Goldilocks zone, comes from. And what Dawkins is referring to there is this idea that there are all these different laws of physics and other universal forces that we're going to be talking about in the weeks to come that have to be configured just right to allow for life. That part is correct. But the way he states this, our existence therefore determines that the fundamental constants of physics had to be in their respective Goldilocks zones. There's two possibilities here. Either that is really stated very clumsily, and it should be stated more along the lines of our existence therefore reveals that the fundamental constants of physics were in their respective Goldilocks zones. I could buy that. But our existence doesn't determine anything. The fact that the universe was well designed for us allows for our existence. Our existence doesn't determine anything. It's oddly stated, and I'm not sure where he's trying to go with that, except later in the book, we go off in a direction that's not good. And this is maybe the problem that we start to run into. Remember, I mentioned before the three options that we looked at for how the universe came into existence. Well, we're going to have three different options again, and they're very similar, looking at the question of how the universe is put together, these things that we would call fine-tuning. There's three different options on the table for how the universe came into existence in such a way that it's friendly for life, that it exists at all, that it didn't just immediately collapse back into a black hole after it formed. Option number one, again, is that an intelligent designer fine-tuned the universe specifically for our existence. Option number two is that the universe, well, these laws and forces and constraints and constants, they had to be this way. They came into existence by necessity in such a way that it immediately facilitated, the support of life. That's going to be really tricky, and that's not one that we're going to spend a lot of time on, because ultimately the only thing that can drive a constant to necessitate all of these forces being what they are is going to be intelligence again. So that's not going to be any different than number one in a lot of ways, and I don't think it helps the argument for naturalism. And then the third option is luck. That ultimately speaking, if you just give the universe enough chances, eventually you're going to get a universe that is friendly to life. And we just happen to have won the universal lottery, and life is what you get. And if we just need enough chances, this is kind of getting into that realm of the multiverse that we're going to talk about in a few episodes down the road. If you just give us enough chances, luck will be able to answer it. Okay, so the question on the table, though, is that really correct? Is that right? I mean, does that make sense? Do you remember back in that very first episode, I said it would be wrong for someone who believes in God to lean on blind faith at every turn. That's wrong, and we're not going to do that. We're not going to just say, well, God did it every time we run into a question. But at the same time, it would be equally wrong to lean on luck at every step of the way. I hate to say it, that's just a God of a different name. So we can't count on luck to be the answer to this question every single step of the way. There are some things that luck explains very well. Let's say my wife and I are going out to dinner and I look at her and say, hey, I'll flip a coin, we'll figure out heads, I pick where we're going, tails, you pick where we're going. I flip the coin, it's tails, and my wife gets to choose the restaurant that we go to. Okay, that probably doesn't require an investigation into what happened. It's 50-50 odds, you're flipping a quarter, heads or tails. You know what? Luck explains that pretty well. But at some point in this process, we're going to lean on numbers way too big and things way too unlikely just to say, well, luck answers that question. And that's where we're about to go. So let me set up Dawkins' next quote for you and help you understand where we're heading in this. Dawkins is about to look at three different things. Number one is the jump from lifelessness to life. Number two is the jump from simple life to complex life. And number three is the question of jumping at some point from complex life to conscious life, life with a consciousness. All three things are remarkably unlikely. And when I say remarkably unlikely, you can't begin to imagine how big the numbers are. And we're going to talk about them down the road and what it would actually take in some of these cases. But the numbers are just off the chart ridiculously unlikely. Dawkins is going to apply the anthropic principle in an effort to get around them. Remember, option number one is that an intelligent designer did this. Okay, that's not going to require getting around it. That's going to look at these things and say, well, they were designed and built that way, and they are the product of intelligence. But option number three is that luck can answer this. And the question is, does the anthropic principle help justify that? And that's what we're going to look at here. Let's start with Richard Dawkins' quote. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. Okay, so you remember what the anthropic principle said. The anthropic principle basically told us that it observes that because we're here, the universe has to be finely tuned to support our existence. But it didn't tell us how. It didn't tell us how unlikely. It didn't tell us when or where or anything else. It just simply observes that it is. So again, Dawkins' quote, nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. So the anthropic principle somehow justifies us determining not only that the jump from lifelessness to life could have occurred just by sheer luck, but that there are other steps along the way that luck can account for, and we don't need to look any further than luck. Luck is all we need. The Beatles got the song wrong. It's not love, it's luck. Luck is all we need. Is that really right? Do we really want to go there? That one of the most important questions in our existence, where did life come from? That we're okay to say that luck is the answer, and that because we're here and we observe that we're here, that's all we need is luck and we don't need to think about it any more than that? That doesn't seem to me like enough of an answer to resolve one of the most important questions that we're facing. But Dawkins continues. Let's be fair to his entire quote. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley in Mendel's Demon has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, our kind of cell with a nucleus and various other complicated features such as mitochondria, which are not present in bacteria, was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. Okay, so he's saying all three of those can simply be accounted for and justified, anthropically justified. We are justified in skipping past them and saying, luck did it, and that's good enough for me. I've got more curiosity than that. That doesn't seem like the anthropic principle helps us at all in that regard. I don't know how you can chalk that off to sheer luck. But let's see where he's going. Maybe he gets this to a better place in all of this. Let's keep going with this quote. One-off events like this might be explained by the anthropic principle along the following lines. There are billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria. No, I'm sorry, I've got to take a little time out on that one. There's no evidence that there are billions of planets in the universe that have developed life at the level of bacteria or any other level. That statement is making a gigantic assumption in an effort, in my opinion at least, in an effort to bump up the odds. And I'll explain why in a minute. But, I mean, do you understand that quote saying that there are billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria, and just putting it out there and walking away from that? Where do you get that from? He's already recognized we have to be in the Goldilocks zone as it relates to the fine-tuning of the universe. We've got to be in a Goldilocks zone within our solar system and our galaxy and a whole bunch of other things to get to a point of even being suitable for life. Many things we're going to talk about down the road. But to just grant that billions of planets have life existing on them in some form I'm sorry, I don't think that scientific evidence supports that at all. But let's continue. There are billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria, but only a fraction of these life forms ever made it across the gap to something like a eukaryotic cell. And of these, a yet smaller fraction managed to cross the later Rubicon to consciousness. If both of these are one-off events, that's a tricky statement, we are not dealing with a ubiquitous, all-pervading process, as we are with ordinary run-of-the-mill biological adaptation. The anthropic principle states that since we are alive, eukaryotic, and conscious, our planet has to be one of the intensely rare planets that has bridged all three gaps. There is so much that is wrong with that paragraph. I just cannot begin to state enough all of the things that are wrong with that. The anthropic principle doesn't tell us anything more than it has happened. It is silent as to all of the important points of how it has occurred. And what Dawkins does is the way he's presented the case, he's a masterful storyteller. And that's one of the things that make his arguments somewhat powerful in some cases, although I don't necessarily think it's this case. He paints an amazing picture. Charles Darwin had the same gift. Darwin could paint a wonderful picture. But when we look at this, there's nothing that supports there's nothing in this that is supported by this. Let's walk through some of his statements. He's broken this into 2 events and not 3 events. And really, there's 4 events that have happened here. We have the formation of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe and all these other things that he's kind of skipped past. But those all need to be explained before we get to this little blue planet that we're on. Then we have the development of life. We have the evolution to complex life. And then we have conscious life. Now, he's compressed that into 2 separate items. There's a whole lot more than just 2 there. And he has granted himself billions of planets that have developed life at the level of bacteria. There is no evidence for that. But let's say that there is. And here's what Dawkins is trying to do. You remember he said in his quote, if these are one-off events, the problem is they're not. And let me explain to you how that works and why. Let's say there are trillions of planets in the universe. And he said there are billions of planets that have developed life. All right, that's not great odds. Let's give him billions of planets. Let's say 5 billion planets in the universe have developed life at the level of bacteria. I've never heard a scientific theory that would support the idea that billions of planets have developed life. To the contrary, what we're realizing is there is no roadmap for how we understand how life developed here, and the idea that it could have occurred billions of other times throughout the universe, let's just say it's remarkably unlikely. But to keep this going, let's give Dawkins that. Let's say 5 billion planets developed life at the level of bacteria. Your next step is going to be to go from planets with bacteria to the next step, which is planets with complex organisms. How many planets of the 5 billion will develop complex life? You don't get to go back to trillions again. You don't get to say they're one-off events and reset the odds. Now you're down to a pool of 5 billion planets to choose from because you've got to start with the ones that developed life at any level. So are the odds better or worse than 1 in 5 billion that complex life could have evolved? Spoiler alert, they're way worse than 1 in 5 billion. Dramatically worse than 1 in 5 billion. Again, there is no good roadmap to get us there. So of the 5 billion planets, let's be super generous and say 100. And that's a ridiculously big number. There's no way 100 planets out of 5 billion could have gone from simple life to complex life. But let's just say that they did. Now, in the same group, you've got to go to conscious life. And by his own admission, that's an equally big of a jump as it is to go from lifelessness to complex life to the next one, which is conscious life. You no longer have trillions of planets. You don't have billions of planets. You have 100 planets. And the odds are prohibitively worse than 1 out of 100. So there's no way for him to get there, and trying to roll everything up into one simple group of numbers and saying, well, they're separate items, they're one-off events. They are not one-off events. Because you need life to generate complex life. So you don't get to separate the two and reset the odds over again. Not saying that's what he's trying to do, but it certainly seems like that's what he's trying to do. Trying to break these up into unrelated events, again, it improves the odds dramatically, but you just can't do it. So there's a whole bunch of problems in what he's trying to do here. And again, what he's trying to tell us is life is so easy and simple. We just need enough chances, and if we have just enough odds, we'll get there. So the question is going to be, if we go back to Dawkins' original statement, does the anthropic principle justify just looking past all of the odds and saying, you know what, luck could account for this? The answer is clearly no. And there's no way that we can get to a point, unless we just have an enormous lack of curiosity in all of this, there's just no way that we can look at this and say, well, you know what, the anthropic principle tells us that we're here, sheer luck can account for it, and we're just going to say luck answers the most important questions in the universe up until the point that we can get natural selection going, which is kind of, at least in my opinion, where I think Dawkins goes in his book. Dawkins, and I think at one point he actually just flat out says the anthropic principle can't explain things like natural selection can. It's just powerless to do so. Natural selection, once it kicks in, is super helpful in helping us to distinguish how one breed of dogs, developed one way versus another. But until you get to a point of natural selection taking over, we're jumping over an enormous number of things, and we seem to be using the anthropic principle to do so. And the anthropic principle would just be silent on these topics. It doesn't give us any useful information on any of this. Later in the book, Dawkins says, once the initial stroke of luck has been granted. So once we attribute the formation of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the appearance of life, the appearance of complex life, and potentially at some point, although you could debate in there, at some point I think he probably would slide this one in here. Once you skip over all of these things, then, this is where he's coming in. Once the initial stroke of luck has been granted, okay, that's a lot of strokes of luck, but, we'll give him that. And the anthropic principle most decisively grants it to us. Natural selection takes over, and natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. I'm going to disagree with that statement when we get down the road a ways, but Does the anthropic principle justify? This is what he is in essence seems to be saying. Does the anthropic principle justify skipping the creation of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the formation of our planet, the fine-tuning of our solar system, the creation, the initial jump from lifelessness to life, and the enormously unlikely jump from simple life to complex life, to get us to a point where natural selection can take over? All of these steps along the way, and there are others that I'm skipping just to bring this along, does the anthropic principle actually justify us skipping all of these things and chalking them up to luck? No, I don't. I couldn't possibly begin to go there, and I don't know how anyone could. Those questions demand answers. These are important questions, and this is why we've been building this foundation as we go forward. You can't just skip over all of them, and that's what Dawkins seems to be doing in all of this. He says later on, and again, he redirects back towards my option number one, that an intelligent designer has to be responsible. He goes back to his same school of thought on this. As ever, the theist answer is deeply unsatisfying because it leaves the existence of God unexplained. Well, yeah, it's true, but we're not trying to answer the question of God's existence. If we wanted to do that, we could do that in a separate question. But the question that we're looking for in this case was, where did life come from in the universe? And not the universe, just on our planet. Where did life come from? So the question we're trying to address is, where did life come from? That seems to be the question that he's trying to address here. From the beginning of the universe up to the point of natural selection taking over is what he's discussing. No. Again, we're not trying to explain God's existence. We're not trying to explain why people in England drive on one side of the road and people in America drive on the other. We're not trying to explain the designated hitter rule in baseball. There's a million things we're not trying to explain. He always seems to bring in this question of, until you can explain God, you can't use God as an answer. And we've talked about that at length in some of the earlier episodes. You can't constantly demand a complete explanation of any answer you put on the table. Ultimately, that's self-defeating. So Dawkins' answer, where he goes with this, is kind of where we expect him to go. This is one of his normal answers that he goes to in debates and in his books. As ever, the theist's answer is deeply unsatisfying because it leaves God's existence unexplained. A God capable of calculating the Goldilocks values for the 6 numbers. He's talking about 6 of the fine-tuning values out there that we'll talk about in future episodes, would have to be at least as improbable as the finely tuned combination of the numbers itself. And that's very improbable indeed. This is exactly the premise of the whole discussion that we're having. It follows that the theist's answer has utterly failed to make any headway towards solving the problem at hand. I see no alternative but to dismiss it, while at the same time marveling at the number of people who can't seem to see the problem and seem genuinely satisfied by the divine knob twiddler argument. But the answer that he's put on the table is, luck is enough, and we can lean on sheer luck, was the quote that he used. Sheer luck is enough to jump us over these things, and since we're here and we know that it happened, we don't need to ask how it happened. We can just chalk it up to luck, and that's enough. I'm not buying that as an answer. I'm just not. So, this idea of somebody actually having to turn the dials and knobs, that somebody had to be responsible for the fine-tuning of the universe, let alone the creation of the universe, well, that's going to be the question we're going to look at in the next couple of episodes. I mean, what are the odds that we're talking about here? If it's a coin toss between my wife and I and where we go out to dinner tonight, I'm golden. I'm in. Luck, 50-50 chance, luck explains the outcome. Now, if my wife won 100 in a row, I might start to suspect she's somehow, rigged the game a little bit against me. But in a normal situation, luck is sufficient to answer that question. But we're not talking about 50-50 odds. This is much worse than Dawkins is allowing for that it really is. Dawkins keeps going back to this idea that luck is enough, and what he attributes, apparently my problem in all of this is my consciousness has not been raised. Dawkins will identify later on, he says, many people have not had their consciousness raised. as biologists have by natural selection and its power to tame improbability. You remember, I think I previously had mentioned that Charles Darwin got a lot of grief back in the day for giving natural selection godlike powers. That statement, I'll read it again, that statement seems to do exactly the same thing. Many people have not had their consciousness raised, as biologists have, by natural selection and its power to tame improbability. Biologists, with their raised consciousness of the power of natural selection to explain the rise of improbable things, are unlikely to be satisfied with any theory that evades the problem of improbability altogether. And then later he says, let's turn then to the anthropic alternative. The only thing that I can tell from reading his book is that he's attributed the entire jump to luck. And he says the anthropic principle justifies us jumping over it. The question on the table is going to be exactly what he says here. Is luck enough to explain the improbability of what we're looking at here? Because he says here, natural selection and its power to tame improbability has raised his consciousness level. Okay, but there's only so far we can lean on luck. And that's going to be what we look at in the episodes to come. Thank you so much for joining us this week and every week as we look at these issues and as we get closer and closer to the end of our journey. Once again, I think it's important to say, as we take this journey together, we're going to respect each other, we're going to answer some tough questions, hopefully we're going to have a good time doing it, and I'll try not to be salty along the way and get a little snarky in any of my commentary. Thank you once again for joining us. You can always find us on our podcast here on our YouTube page. If you like this podcast, I hope you'll hit the like and subscribe button. You can also find us on our website at prooftograce.com. You can reach out to us with questions at prooftograce@yahoo.com. And you can also find our podcasts on iTunes and Spotify. Thank you so much for joining us once again, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.